us for today's webinar, Researching LGBTQ Communities, Best Practices for State and Local Surveys. We turn to our moderator for today's discussion, Brad Sears, who is the Rand Schrader Distinguished Scholar of Law and Policy at the Williams Institute. Brad?
Hi, good morning, everyone, or maybe good afternoon for you. I'm so thrilled that you can join us for this webinar to introduce our new guide for state and local surveys to gather the data we need about state and local LGBT communities. This is some of the work of the Williams Institute, which I think all of us find the most rewarding, working with community groups and partners to have an impact. We have a really rich discussion today, full of a lot of fantastic experts. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panel, and then we're going to turn it over to them. I wanted to start by saying some quick thank yous. First and foremost, the guide was made possible through a grant from Cedars-Sinai's Medical Foundation, really committed to advancing healthcare for everyone in Los Angeles and California, including members of the LGBTQ community. So we really appreciate Cedars and their investment in making this guide possible. I want to give a big shout out as well to all of the co-authors of this report, in particular Laurel Sprague and Aidan Chime, who really led the process and contributed so much expertise and work into making the report, as well as to the other co-authors, including myself, Alana Redfield, Kiana Taylor, Neko Castleberry, and Jody Herman, some of whom you'll hear from in just a minute. As I said, we're really excited about this work, and this is a time of great need for LGBT communities to actively participate in making sure we have the data to tell the truth about our lives to inform law and policy. Earlier this spring, the Williams Institute released an analysis that the federal government had already eliminated sexual orientation and gender identity questions from over 360 surveys, eliminating either gender identity and or sexual orientation. So right now we're experiencing a great loss in the amount of data that we've had to inform policy about our communities. But really, since day one, the Williams Institute has been committed not only to doing great research, but making sure that we have the data available to do that research, including at the state and local levels. If you go back 25 years ago, our very first reports were focused on same-sex couples in Texas, reports which informed the Supreme Court decision overturning sodomy laws, and reports on same-sex couples in California, reports which led to our California legislature being the first legislature in the country to pass a comprehensive domestic partnership act. Since then, we have worked with communities literally from here to Kathmandu and doing community research on behalf of LGBTQ communities, including a number of surveys here in Los Angeles County, surveys in all over the country, including Northeast Florida, in Nepal, one of the largest community surveys of LGBTQ people ever done there, and we're currently working on a survey in China right now this spring. So this is a really important part of our work, working with communities doing this research. To help introduce the guide and let you know more about what you can find in it, I want to introduce our first speaker, who is Jody Herman, who is the Reed Rasmussen Senior Scholar of Law and Policy at the Williams Institute. Thanks, Jody.
Thanks so much, Brad. And hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you today to discuss community-based research. I'm going to present a very brief overview of the guide that we just published, so you can have some insights into what's all included. Next slide, please. So here's the table of contents for the guide. So there's 10 substantive chapters, and then chapter 11 contains a resource list that we hope will be helpful. So we'll go through each one of these chapters very briefly, just to give you a taste of what's in each one. Next slide. So I should mention that the principles and approaches in this guide are intended to be like broadly relevant for conducting LGBTQ survey research, particularly in the United States. But we primarily include examples and resources from our experience conducting research in Los Angeles County and in the state of California, where we're based. For researchers in California, we intend these resources to provide a good starting point, a rich starting point for you. But for researchers in other countries and other states, we hope that the examples here will provide some direction for where to look for similar resources. And then this guide is written for people with some research experience. It's not really intended to be a full research training, on all aspects of survey research. When using this guide, it's important that research teams include members with training in research methods who can kind of collaboratively help design and carry out the study. At the same time, we hope that community members newly involved in research will also find this guide to be a useful introduction to research and what community-based research is all about. And the resource list at the end of the guide will also be of help for those who wish to learn more about conducting survey research. Next slide, Kim. So chapter 2 is called the Continuum of Community Engaged Research. So there are various ways in which community can be involved or direct research. So this includes considerations for identifying the level of engagement that's ideal for your research project, including how will the research questions be established? How is the community defined? How much time and funding are available, which is very important for kind of the boundaries of a project, and planning for shared decision-making in the process. Next slide, Kim. So chapter 3 is entitled Conducting Research That is Effective in the Law and Policy World. And so this contains such things as the problems you would like to identify and or address, the law and policy environment in which you'll be doing your work, identifying key decision makers who might be good recipients of the work that you are doing, and relevance of the research that you're doing for decision makers. So chapter 4 is about the research landscape. So it's important to understand what research already exists. You certainly don't want to reinvent the wheel with your project if research already exists that you can utilize in order to do what you need to do with it. Finding relevant studies that have either already answered some of the questions that you have or might be helpful in assisting you in doing your work. And chapter 4 also contains considerations for considerations before you engage in developing a new original survey. So chapter 5 is about developing and maintaining community partners and engagement. And this chapter covers outreach and engagement strategies, options for meeting diverse community needs, respecting time and resource constraints, and understanding and accommodating the priorities and goals of various study partners, and engaging the community regardless of where your project falls on the community engagement continuum, which will be described in detail in the report. Chapter 6 covers the research design and methodology. So this is about identifying the research questions, figuring out what data you need to answer those questions. So selecting your data collection approach, choosing a sampling method, and that's particularly pertinent for survey research, and considering funding sources and human resource needs into putting that consideration into the design of your project. Chapter 7 is about developing the questionnaire itself. So if you are doing survey research, you need to create the survey. And so to do that, we talk about a few different steps. And first is drawing on reliable, valid measures that already exist. So again, in the interest of not reinventing the wheel. There are well-tested inclusive demographic measures that can be used that there are good examples of out there in the world, and so we provide some guidance on that. We describe measures for sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics that are already in existence or can be adapted for your work. There are also established measures for policy relevant questions. So if you have a particular policy area that you're interested in, there are probably surveys on that particular topic that might be relevant for your work. And then preparing to field your survey, there's a lot of work that has to be done to make a survey actually ready to go out to participants. So we discussed that as well. In Chapter 8, we talk about how to actually field the survey. And there are certain things you should consider regarding confidentiality, privacy, and ethics. We talk a little bit about institutional review boards. We talk about recruitment, the campaigns for recruitment and materials you might use, ensuring accessibility to the survey, and then fraud prevention procedures, especially if the survey is a paid opportunity. Then we get into data analysis. So you conduct the survey and you have a mountain of data, hopefully, as a result. So how are you going to manage the data? How are you going to clean the data? We provide advice on how to code sexual orientation and gender identity variables. We describe ways to do descriptive analyses and how to compare LGBT subgroups and between LGBT and non-LGBT subgroups. And then we provide some guidance on analysis of open-ended questions, which would be questions that have a right and option. You're going to get qualitative data as a result of those. And so we have some advice for that type of analysis. Chapter 10 is strategies for presenting the data in compelling ways. So once you've got the data and you've analyzed it, you need to put it out into the world. So we talk about engagement with community participants and study partners prior to releasing it out broadly to the public. We talk about synthesizing the main messages and findings using accessible language, and strategic dissemination planning that helps when you're working with folks with communications backgrounds for sure, and availability and responsiveness of the research. So again, Chapter 11 is a resource guide, so hopefully that will be helpful. And of course, our gratitude goes out to all our partners and the community members that have participated in the research that we highlight in the guide. That includes Trans Latina Coalition, LGBT communities, mutual aid networks, local organizations affected by the 2025 Los Angeles fires, San Gabriel Valley LGBTQ Center, the Connie Norman Transgender Empowerment Center, Flux, the LA County Department of Public Health, LA County LGBTQ Commission, and of course, those involved at the Williams Institute, either currently or in the past. So thanks very much. And I'll send it back to Brad to launch our discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Jody. As you can tell, there's just a ton of information in the guide. So what we'd like to do next is turn to a conversation, and I'm going to ask our panelists to come on to their screens to pull out some of the major kind of themes, findings of the guide, but also to draw on their own rich expertise in doing this important research and participating in these collaborations between researchers and LGBTQ community members. Before we jump into that, and as they turn on their video screens, I just want to remind people that this session is being recorded, and we're going to put it up on the line later. You're free to use the chat if you want to protect your privacy. You can change your name to initials. We do have members of the press who've joined us today. We actually have over 150 of you out there, so we're very excited about that. You can also ask our panelists questions. We encourage you to use the Q&A function as opposed to the chat if you have any questions so we can be sure to see them and respond to them at the end of our discussion. So we're going to turn to our panelists next. The first thing that I'm going to ask them to do is to briefly introduce themselves. And then, since they have such an incredible amount of expertise, talk about one survey or one project that was particularly meaningful for them. I will get the ball rolling and say that in the 1980s, I went to Blue Springs High School in Blue Springs, Missouri, which was a very rural and conservative part of Missouri. I knew two people who were out when I was in high school. One immediately transferred upon the people finding out that they were LGBTQ. The other was physically attacked and then had to leave the school after that. So it was very rewarding in 2015 for the Williams Institute to do a project initiated by high school students in Blue Springs, Missouri from my old high school, which led to that city council passing protections in education as well as in employment and housing for LGBTQ people in Blue Springs, Missouri. So that's one of my favorite projects that was very personally meaningful to me. And we're going to turn next to Sunitha.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Brad, and to the other panelists that are joining us today. My name is Sunitha Menon. My pronouns are she and her, or they and them, and I'm the executive director for the Los Angeles County LGBTQ Plus Commission. For those of you who are joining and haven't heard of our commission before, we are a semi-new commission. We had our first meeting in June of 2024. We're made up of 15 subject matter experts that are appointed by the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors. And our role is to make sure that we are exclusively looking at how to provide advice and recommendations directly to the 5 supervisors, as well as the 39 county departments that are under their leadership. And what we're looking to do is provide advice and recommendations that impacts the well-being, safety, and overall health and welfare of LGBTQ plus people in Los Angeles County. So unlike some of these amazing panelists who are researchers, I am not, but I love the research that they do. And one of the things that I think has been really important is finding ways that our commission can make those recommendations to the supervisors or individual county departments. And the best way to do that is to have updated research that we can utilize to say, here's what the issues are, here's what research is finding, and here are our recommendations. So one of the things that I think has been really helpful for our commission most recently are 2 different reports. One is Gender Identity Hate Crimes in California, which was published by the Williams Institute in December of 2025. And the other was Violence and Harassment Against Transgender Adults in California, published in November of 2025. And our commission is actually taking both of those reports and looking at ways in which we can use the recommendations and work alongside the sheriff's department to increase the safety of LGBTQ plus people when they're interacting with law enforcement. So really excited to be here today. And Brad, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. And we're going to jump right to Bambi. It's our next panelist.
Greetings, beautiful people, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with all of you. I hope that you are doing well, and I hope that you're having a beautiful day. My name is Bambi Salcedo, and I do have the privilege to be the president and CEO of the Translatino Coalition. I am so grateful that we're having this discussion. But one of, our organization have been working with the Williams Institute for many, many years, and I'm so grateful for that. But one of the projects that I'm super excited to talk about was the first project, research project with the city of Los Angeles about, I think, 7 years ago, or no, 5 years ago, something like that. And it was the study for the quality of life of transgender, expansive, and intersex people here in Los Angeles. And this was the first time that the city actually invested in trying to find, information that is specifically about our community. And from then, other projects and other partnerships have come to fruition, and I'm really grateful that the Williams Institute, who is the leading research entity in the country, is able to partner with us. So thank you so much. And I'll turn it back to you, Brad.
Great. And I think, Alana, we're going to turn to you next.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Alana Redfield. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Federal Policy Director at the Williams Institute. And I most of the time work on legal issues, legal research, and things like amicus briefs, other things like that that the Williams Institute does to try to make sure that research is informing policymakers. But I have had this amazing opportunity to jump in on some projects here and there where our social science scholars are working with community members to do cool work. And the one that really is the closest to my heart is the LA County Trans and Non-Binary Survey that we'll talk about a bit more today. But Jody and Bambi and others were involved in this project. Where we got to really engage with and somewhat to some extent pick up on the quality of life survey that Bambi was describing and look at where trans and non-binary people were in LA in 2023. I also want to mention that before I worked at the Williams Institute, I worked for New York City government, which is a local government in a sense, but also New York City's budget is the size of many state budgets. So it's kind of an interesting place to do research and policy work. And I was really honored to be able to participate in two studies that engaged low-income transgender communities in New York City. One was looking at people who were accessing food stamps and TANF, which is cash assistance, and as well as Medicaid in New York, as well as another study that looked at the experiences of trans and non-binary and intersex people in the shelter system. So I just wanted to mention those because I just think it's so powerful when local government does take these initiatives, like the three I described, to really learn about and engage with community members.
Great. And then Jody.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. And like Alana, I'm of course very proud of the work that we did with the LA County Trans and Non-Binary Survey with Trans Bambi and the Trans Latina Coalition. That was a fantastic project. I'm also thinking back to my very first community-based project that I worked on with the DC Trans Coalition many years ago, which included a survey of the trans community in DC's experiences using public restrooms. And, we found out that people were being denied access to restrooms, harassed, even physically assaulted when using restrooms. And that project was relevant to campaigns around enforcing the newly amended DC Human Rights Act. We had worked to add gender identity or expression to the non-discrimination law in DC. And then the survey findings helped inform the development of enforcement regulations in DC that would then explicitly cover the use of restrooms. So it was helpful in that effort, and it was great to see how that research actually impacted local regulations. And then we adapted those questions in that survey for the US Trans Survey. So that DC bathroom survey has kind of lived on ever since. And I think that's one project that our DC Trans Coalition folks can all be proud of.
Great. Thanks so much, Jody. And thanks everyone for sharing those experiences and about those research projects. Just reminder to everyone, if you have a question, please use our question and answer function. You can ask your questions as we go along, but we'll have time to respond to them after we conclude this brief panel. We're next going to go to Alana. Obviously, the mission of the Williams Institute is really about impacting law and policy. And I know one of the chapters that Jody mentioned kind of focuses on this. So especially in this current environment where things seem very challenging, kind of how do you go about developing research questions that are relevant to LGBTQ law and policy?
Thank you. And I would start by saying that some research isn't going to be necessarily relevant to the immediate policy environment. There may be other reasons that a community organization might want to lead LGBT research, including its own priorities. Um, but that said, so much research can be so powerful when it is responsive to policy needs. And as we know, we've talked about in some examples already, Jody's example, and others, and Sunita mentioned as well, the research can really directly inform policy work. So I'd say there's really three considerations. The first one is thinking about what's the issue you want to address. So sometimes there's something that's very immediate and clear. Like, for example, if your community members are being targeted by ICE at that moment, then it can be very apparent what a priority might be to understand and find solutions for. Other times, you might have already conducted a needs assessment or know through other information, maybe through federal surveys about problems or situations that are affecting your community members. And so you can identify these issues such as, let's say, housing precarity or access to employment authorization or other policy issues that that research might actually have a direct impact on. So the next consideration are who are the people? And what I mean by that is that it's important to understand who the stakeholders are, and that can range from people who might just know more about the issue, like other community leaders or subject matter experts that study the issue, or someone who's been leading a campaign for years on the issue, but also decision makers, people in positions of power who might be allies, who might be interested, or even maybe who aren't familiar with the issue or understand it yet. So I think, trying to understand the people is a really important consideration. And when you do engage with subject matter experts, for example, you can understand the nuances of the issue a lot differently. If you speak to policymakers, you may find out that they have specific priorities or interests. They might be very interested in child welfare, or might be very interested in economic justice or food security. And you can find opportunities where your own research and your own community needs align really well with things that those policymakers are interested in. Um, of course, sometimes, there may be an urgent need and you have to figure out how to make someone interested in it. So that's a whole other conversation. And the third thing I want to mention that's important to consider is what the opportunities are at the moment. And of course, one can always create opportunities, but um, this could be something like there is a new law being passed or that just got passed, an ordinance or a town hall, so these are all events. These are all things that are time sensitive that um, could be leveraged, where your research could get submitted and could actually play a role in determining the outcome. Could be a proposed rule by a state agency or by the federal government. Or it could be an opportunity where, let's say that there is a philanthropist who wants to give away millions of dollars and they're looking for evidence-based solutions to problems affecting LGBT communities. These are all different kinds of opportunities. So I think, really it's about thinking about if you're thinking about the policy environment and how to work in it, it's about identifying the issue, the people, and the opportunities. And I would say, to go back to Brad's original question, that even in this environment where currently there's a lot of hostility from many federal policymakers, there are still policymakers who want to do great work at the federal level, as well as really supportive environments in California and even in places where, like my home state of New Hampshire, where there is currently a very anti-LGBT swing in their lawmaking. There are still lots of people who want to get engaged, and there's ways that the research can help them do what they want to do.
Great, thanks so much, Alana. And kind of with that, I want to turn next back to you, Jody. Obviously, these are collaborations between researchers and community members. What's some advice as a researcher that you would have for researchers in doing work with LGBTQ communities?
Well, I could probably talk about this for an hour, but I will try to just have a couple thoughts and maybe back up a little bit from your question, Brad, about whether community-based research is really the way to go for your research questions. So first I'd say the guide is a helpful place to look. of course, if you're interested in doing research with LGBTQ communities. And some of what I'll say is outlined in the guide a bit, but one thing to consider is if you have come up with research questions, but you want to do community-based research, consult with community members to see if those questions actually align with their priorities. For instance, like some research questions may be more relevant to like conversations that are going on more in an academic space, or there's like a gap in the research literature in a particular field and you want to fill it. Like those are research projects that people can engage in. But if your research interests don't necessarily align with the community priorities, you can consider other ways to get community feedback on your work. If you want to be informed by the community, and one way is to create a community advisory board with community members that advise on the project along the way. But of course, you want to make it worth their while. You don't just want to inform them of things that have already been decided. They should be involved in the decision making in the study. And so if you are doing community-based research and your priorities do align with that of the community and you want to work collaboratively on this project, the community definitely needs to benefit from the work. The process should be collaborative and the research results should be meaningful and useful to the community. Unfortunately, I've seen instances where researchers just have, engaged the community in a research project, gotten their data, and the community never sees the results or gets any benefit from it. And that should not be happening. It's important to pay those involved and participants for their time. There can be professional development opportunities for community members who are engaged in the research. If you do a survey, for instance, community members can be trained to serve as survey recruiters, and there may be other training opportunities along the way. So it should be collaborative and meaningful, and the results should benefit the community. Two quick things. Everyone is busy, including community members. Don't just assume that people are just hanging out and waiting to leap at the opportunity to engage in your research project. Be respectful of people's time. Build time into timelines to account for people's schedules. That's really important. And finally, do excellent work. Just because something is labeled community research does not mean that the standard should be any less. We all strive for excellence and rigor in this work. And so I would maintain that approach.
Great, Jody. I think as you were kind of alluding to, these relationships can be complicated. There's a lot of kind of competing interests that can come into play that need to be worked out in these partnerships, and not everything always goes perfectly. And so I'm sure each of you have had some experience with something that went less than perfectly, but hopefully learned something from that you can share with others. So we're going to do a speed round and have everyone quickly respond to this question, kind of what's something that didn't go so well, maybe with one of your projects, and what lesson did you learn from it that you'd like to share with others? And let's go Sunitha, Bambi, Alana, and then Jody.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Brad. And as I mentioned before, with my role in Los Angeles County, it's really to provide that advice and recommendations to the supervisors and county departments based on research, based on what we're seeing that's happening across the country. So this isn't necessarily something that's gone wrong, but something that we struggle with is how quickly things are changing at the federal level and how that's impacting individuals here in Los Angeles County. And so one of the things that our commission is constantly looking to do is to find information that is the most updated so that we're not looking at information from even 3 years ago, because situations are so different, particularly for trans and queer people within Los Angeles County, particularly for individuals in mixed documented households or who are undocumented themselves. And so that's not necessarily an issue about research. It's an issue about where our country is, and really appreciative for the Williams Institute for all the research that you're doing, and Bambi and everybody that's on this for all the research you're doing about how this is impacting people individually right now.
So for I want to share an experience. I will not share names or institutions, but an experience that happened to me and to us as an organization was that, we had an agreement with this particular institution that we were going to work together on this research project, but then there was a change in leadership, right? And so um, the new leadership uh, wanted to do the research project, but didn't want to have equal partnership in the collaboration, right? And obviously, this minimized the contributions that we as a community bring to the table, right? And so, um, obviously, when this type of situations happen, it's sort of like backtracks, the project. And like sometimes when we get funded to do these projects, there are specific timelines, right, that we need to meet. And so all of this, you know decision making and agreements or disagreements that perhaps happen during projects could delay projects and could, ultimately impact community, right? Because, we do research to ensure that we highlight the needs of communities, right? And when there are people who, um, I guess, are doing whatever, this work to essentially benefit themselves, as Jody mentioned, right? Like, and not really including community as thoughtful partners, really delays the process that requires for us to have readily available information that could lead to policy changes, that could lead to the changes that our communities need, right? And so I think we need to be mindful in a way, right? Like, if we are entering into this partnership, then we need to enter it 100%, not just halfway, right? Like, we can be wishy-washy, right? So yeah, that was my experience in one of the projects.
I would say for me, one thing that is hard to do, especially coming from my original training as a lawyer advocating for people, for trans people in New York, is to not get ahead of my hypothesis. Meaning, like, sometimes I'm like, trans people have this terrible experience with police, or they have this terrible experience in shelter, or have this terrible experience, it's like documented, it's real, it's proven. But when we study that, it's important to proceed in a scientific manner to understand the nuances of that. And it can be really easy to start from our conclusion and work backwards, and we don't believe in that. We think it's so important to actually see what the data show. And I think you can see why that's important when you look at the current federal administration and how they're issuing executive orders saying what the conclusions are going to be, and then creating research to support those conclusions. You can see why that's problematic. So I think, we can know that, our anecdotal experiences and the work we do is going to probably be proven through, but that if we are able to really do the most rigorous scientific evaluations, that we'll be able to get the best quality research to actually support the policy changes that we need.
And I might have some advice that's more like logistical or technical here, but one lesson learned is that, and Bambi alluded to this as well, that projects, they always seem to take more time than you ever planned for. So they require some flexibility, but sometimes there are things that are inflexible that you butt up against. Like, for instance, some changes might require you updating your institutional review board protocols, and that has to be submitted and reviewed, and that takes time. And it's important to work with institutional partners who are involved, especially those that may have larger bureaucracies or can be other potential bottlenecks in the process. I'd say develop those relationships up front and let them know what you're trying to accomplish and the flexibility that you might need, and see if you can lay the groundwork for getting your needs met quickly early on if you can. Um, uh, understand where you can have flexibility and where there are things that are non-negotiable. Like again, changing research protocols might spark a IRB review. And also, and here's another other pieces. Again, I believe it's important to compensate participants for their time, but be careful in how that's done. For instance, make sure you have access to the funds that you need to pay people and be able to get payment in their hands. And also be careful how it's done in regard to like a paid survey process. So if we've had surveys before that were paid, you were paid to take them, and they were subject to bot attacks, for instance. People who are intending to, fraudulently collect payments for the survey using bot attacks. So get all your protections in place ahead of time. Know the people that are involved that potentially could be a bottleneck. Try to get a hold of your timelines and be reasonable about them, and add in extra time if you can, just for the unknown, the things that might happen in your project that you can't anticipate.
Great. Thanks for everyone for sharing those experiences and those lessons. We're going to wrap up with a couple more questions for our panelists and then turn to your questions. Just a reminder, if you have a question, to use the Q&A function to put your question in, and we'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible. But Bambi, you kind of mentioned some experiences that you've had with research partners. But kind of, what do you look for in a research partner? What are you hoping for, and what do you look for?
Yeah, so I mean, the truth is that, people who are trans, gender expansive, or intersex, who are academics and researchers are very, very limited, right? And so, but people don't necessarily have to be part of our own community to do this research, right? Like I said, we have had like great partnerships with the Williams Institute and Jody and Alana and everybody, and so like we're really grateful for that. But for us, we use community participatory research, right? And so we want to be included in the beginning of everything, right? A lot of times, again, we get emails from people from different places that they already have like research projects in place, and they just want us to share their research or their surveys and stuff like that, and that is not a thoughtful partnership, right? Like, we want to be involved. We want to know what is it that people are trying to get information about our community, right? Like, we want to be able to design the tools. We want to be able to like work together, right? Like in all aspects of the project, including the dissemination of the information, right? One of the great things that happened in one of the projects that we work with the Williams Institute, and also with the LGBTQ commission, right? Like, was when we were able to present the results to the Board of Supervisors, right? Of the quality of life for TGI people here in the county. And so to me, that is a partnership that we want to continue, not just with the Williams Institute, but with any other research entity that want to partner with us, right? We want to be part of it from the beginning to end, and perhaps even continue in our partnership. So that's the kind of partners that we look for, that we want to work with.
Great, thanks Bambi. That's really helpful. And then Sunitha, just kind of final question for our panel is going to you. Do you have any advice for researchers about how to engage with policymakers?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that we're doing the majority of in providing advice and recommendations to the supervisors in Los Angeles County. I'm not sure how many of you know this. Los Angeles County is the most populous county in the nation. And so 1 in 34 Americans lives in Los Angeles County. So being able to provide advice and recommendations that's research based to the supervisors who have influence over, or are able to at least take a stance in state legislation is really important. Now, one of the things I love my researchers. I love you all so much. Making sure that your key points are concise and accessible to the public is really important. One of the things that I realized when I came to the county is that so much of the county is really opaque for the general person who's trying to understand how the county functions, how decisions are made. And so making things as simple and concise as you can be, really with an eye at how am I making this personal to the person who's actually the policymaker, or how am I making it accessible to the reality that they will see in their everyday life. And if they don't see this in their everyday life because they're not part of the community, how do I really bring in those personal stories so that they understand the importance of how this research can shift policy? And then lastly, I would just say, which everybody says all the time, is understanding the current political landscape and then saying, what type of research do we need now? And looking at what has happened historically, what types of research do we think are going to be needed moving forward? And how are we kind of proactively thinking about that type of research? And so, for me, it's really about making sure that all of this intense hard work that you all are doing is easily accessible, easy to understand, and easy for them to see how this will improve the lives or society that they're in charge of supporting. So really excited for you researchers for all this work you're doing, and making things simple is very important.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone on our panel. We're now going to turn to our questions, which there are a lot. So I'm going to try to combine some questions into some topics for the panels to address. So we can get through some of the topics. We're not going to be able to get to all the questions, unfortunately, but we'll do the best that we can. And the first topic is, this is obviously a very challenging environment for LGBTQ people, and safety and privacy are a concern. So several of our questions have to deal with safety and privacy, and involve some of the questions are like, how do you disseminate the data but still protect the privacy of participants? How do you kind of balance the need for access and privacy? Are you folks, if you've worked in states or locations that are even more challenging for trans people or LGBTQ people, are they still participating in surveys? Is it harder to recruit people? And if people use online forms to respond to surveys such as Google Forms or Google Drives, are there privacy protections there? So if anyone wants to weigh in on one of the aspects of kind of the safety and privacy issues of doing this research in this current environment.
Yeah, Brad, I can talk about that a little bit. So I'd say one of the main tools that universities in particular have to protect human subjects, which is the human subjects research, so people who engage in research activities, is through the Institutional Review Board, and they set up expectations for data security and privacy to protect people who engage in research. So if you are conducting research in an academic setting, or even not in an academic setting, you know the Institutional Review Board will provide information about that, and information on how to do it. And this is if you're a researcher. If you're outside a university, there are ways to access IRBs to do your research. But in terms of just like the nuts and bolts of it, we engage in anonymous data collection a lot of the time. It's we do focus groups and things like that where people will like personally be there and identify, but we try to have our survey research be anonymous, and so the data that are collected would not be able to identify the person who's doing it. And like in an instance where like sensitive information might be collected, there's and I forget all the instances in which this would be appropriate, but there are like certificates of confidentiality that you used to be able to get. I would assume you still can through like the National Institutes of Health that would protect your data from, being sought out under certain circumstances. So I would look for, if you were, have a survey that you're thinking of engaging in as a participant, I would look for upfront, there should be an explanation of who's engaging in the research and what they'll be doing with your data, whether it's anonymous or not, and what data security protocols are in place. Those are things that I would be looking for, like right off the bat.
Yeah, I would say, to offer a pragmatic and somewhat bleak response and then get better from there. Um, the truth is that there are risks to sharing information, and that in the United States, our laws are not, there's no comprehensive protection for your personal information. And I hope that we move towards that existing on a federal level. We also recognize that right now we're operating in a situation where the federal government is leveraging information like immigration information to pursue people, to target them. So there is this reality that there are going to be risks with any kind of data sharing. But just to kind of build on what Jody was saying, there are so many types of collection that are much more protected. And I would say in general, when I'm talking about this, I consider surveys to be a really distinct thing from administrative collections, meaning anything where you're sharing your information and it's confidential and you're sharing it with researchers to study something specific is going to have a layer of protection that's going to be better than if you're sharing your data through like a medical record system or if you're sharing your data through government information. Um, so all that to say that I think in general surveys offer a lot more protection and that like also there are a crucial source of information in the near future as we need to continue studying LGBT communities. And there are sources like the US Trans Survey that are privately run that are like one of the most incredible sources of information about trans people in the United States. So their surveys have a kind of like special place in my heart. And then the other thing I mentioned is that in many places, even administrative data is protected. And California has very comprehensive laws on data collection, requiring agencies to ask these questions. And those data are protected under non-discrimination laws in California. And there's even a bill pending that would restrict those the use of those data even further, just to really make sure that data are collected for research purposes only and used for the benefit of LGBT communities. So, in summary, I would say there is a really, pragmatically speaking, there's always going to be a little bit of risk with sharing information, but the reward of sharing that information is really hard to hard to quantify. It's so positive, and also that the context in which you share it, if it's in surveys, particularly surveys that are run by non-government organizations or governments in protective environments, can be really powerful.
I'm going to switch to the next topic. And again, this is kind of pulling together several of the questions, but I think several, again, speaking to the current environment, the basic question is, does research still matter in this anti-science, anti-research environment created by this administration? Can you still persuade people with research? Is there any advice about trying to reach people if you're testifying before at a hearing that just seem like they're not open to hearing arguments, or at least arguments based on your research? Any thoughts on that?
If you don't mind, if I can jump in really quick, I think it's super important. I think research is one of the things that could provide information, right? About who we are as people, about our needs, about, like a specific thing, right? And I think particularly in these moments, we need to be able to find ways for us to continue to do the work that needs to happen to really highlight the needs of our communities, right? So that we can in turn get the resources that our community needs. And I also want to um, remind people, right? Like that what is happening at the federal level, right? Like it's not going to be there forever, right? That this is just something that is unfortunately happening in all of our communities, but you know, things are going to change hopefully sooner rather than later. I know that they're causing a lot of damage, right? That could be long lasting, but I want for us to be encouraged and for us to see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? Like, and also seeing the importance of research and the role that research plays in the collaborations that happen through research, to ensure that policies are made to better the life of people, that resources are allocated to support people, to like we really we can't give up, right? Like, yes, things are crazy, things are hard, things are challenging, um, but we need to continue. I think we have a duty to fulfill, um, and I believe that we can do it. We just need to be brave and courageous, and understand that it is possible to continue to do the work that we're doing despite the challenges and the craziness that is happening.
I also just wanted to add from my perspective as somebody that works with a lot of community organizations, in doing the research, you're giving color and light to our community, and in making sure that we are represented and there is documentation, there is data that we do exist, and particularly with trans, non-binary, and intersex people, making sure that there is that recognition that we have always existed and will always exist past this administration, past what's happening. And that data and information and research is going to be critical as we move forward and rebuild from where we're at now. And so I think research is actually even more important now because they're trying to hold it back because it is so important. And so recognizing that, looking at how, the different departments are trying to stop using SOGI data, they're literally trying to erase us, and you can't let that happen. And that's where the researchers have to step up and say, how are we doing this, getting this information? And the community organizations, how are we reaching out to our communities in a way that's safe, where we're protecting their data and then being able to utilize that moving forward?
Great. The other questions had to deal with some other things that are a product of the current environment, which includes really challenges in funding this type of research. There were some more specific questions about getting community participation involved, even when you're not doing surveys, but doing secondary data analysis. How do you get community members involved with that? A dissemination of research findings to the lay public, and particularly empowering trans and non-binary people with research, how to work with IRBs. A lot of great questions. We're going to try to address this the best we can after we conclude, because we only have 2 minutes left. But we'll try to follow up with you individually on any of those remaining questions. I just want to end with kind of 2 thoughts. First of all, as to that last question and why this guide is focused on state and local research, is that in the history of LGBTQ rights, so many of our great developments that became national policies started with at the local level. A lot of the first non-discrimination protections were passed as local ordinances by cities. Many of them were just implemented by businesses long before they were legally required. And so those are audiences for your research. When you look at civil rights protections for LGBTQ people, you look at the history of things like the first prohibition of sexual harassment in this country, it happened through local ordinances. Domestic partnerships were first recognized at the local level. So there is a lot of challenging work, and Jude, if you're still on there, there's work I'm sure that the Des Moines City Council will do that the state of Iowa will not do right now. So I think one important thing in this moment is to think about audiences and to find those opportunities where you can. And then I will just wrap up the webinar by quoting our great research director, Laurel Sprague, who says it's just really important. What this time has taught us is that our community needs to own our own data, that there is too much vulnerability in having just government data collections and sources out there, and it's really incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we continue to generate this data and we have our control over how that data is both used and protected. So I want to thank everyone for an excellent discussion. Let's hear it digitally, at least, for all of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today. And like I said, we'll follow up with resources and answer specific questions after the webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.